Okay, this video is about how epidemiology helps your health. And one of the ways epidemiology helps you is because a person wants to decide what's the best thing for them to do as an individual. And people have said to me, well, how do you sort out what the truth is with regard to nutrition? There's so much contradictory information. Let me tell you something. There is not that much contradictory information. With a reductionist type study, you can make anything seem to be the best when you just narrow the parameters of the study and you only have a small population and you study something for a couple of months. So what I'm trying to tell you is this. When you look at long-term epidemiology with billions of people, it's pretty obvious that plant-based diets are the best by far. You know, a typical example is, let's look at China. The rural Chinese before the 1970s, when they would eat primarily a rice-based diet, like 80 to 90% of their calories from rice, they're all skinny. There's no such thing as a fat person. Okay, now that the urban Chinese are eating more and more meat and junk food, they got fast food restaurants, there's tons of fat Chinese, tons of fat diabetic Chinese. And guess what? It's the same everywhere. It's always the same. When people eat their old-fashioned, traditional, endemic, plant-based diets, they are skinny, and they don't have any hypertension or almost next to zero hypertension, diabetes, coronary artery disease. Once they start eating meat, oils, processed food, there's tons of them are fat, diabetic with coronary arteries and all this other stuff. Here's the typical population. The Tarahumara of northern Mexico, separated from the Pima population, demographically the same in about 1848, Mexican-American War, okay? Then the Tarahumara continue with their old-fashioned diet, rice, beans, corn, squash, and greens, local greens. They can run ultramarathons. They're famous for running a couple hundred miles in 2 days. All right? And then the Pima, what happened with them? They started eating the standard American diet, the SAD diet, tons of obesity, diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease. Okay? Another example, epidemiology. Look at the Seventh-day Adventists. They're based in Loma Linda, like a suburb of Los Angeles in California. You compare them to other Californians, they're much healthier. For them, being a vegetarian is more of a religious thing. But they're just a lot healthier. Even the fact that they're sort of religious vegetarians more so than myself will be a health vegan. Anyways, next population, the Okinawans, subgroup of the Japanese. They used to eat 85% of their calories from sweet potatoes. Super healthy. They were famous for having the most centenarians, people that lived 100 that were still healthy and mentally sharp. Most of the mainland Japanese persons were relatively healthy. They did have a tendency in Japan to smoke too many cigarettes and to have too much salt in their food, but they were still relatively healthy. When they would migrate to Hawaii and sort of take on a little bit of an Americanized style of eating, they'd become less healthy. These are called the Japanese Migrant Studies. And then when they go to California and take on even more of an Americanized, standard American diet type of eating and lifestyle, they become fatter and sicker. Okay, and by the way, it's the same always. This is the way it always is. That's one of the nice things about being a vegetarian and a vegan is when it comes to health studies, they always win. Yanomamo in South America, they were studied. They were only eating about 200 milligrams a day of salt. They don't have any problems with hypertension. Same thing with the rural Kenyans. They don't have any problem with hypertension, okay? Let's look next at rationing. There's been some rationing, you know, in the first World War I, World War II, and more recently in Cuba when they got less support from the Soviet Union. As soon as meat becomes less available, the population dramatically lowers its risk of coronary artery disease. So the rationing studies all support that as well. Dennis Pritikin was kind of famous for his analysis of the rationing studies. And there's been other ones. Like I said, it's not just one country. Finland, they switched to a low sodium diet. Their incidence of coronary artery disease and stroke just dramatically dropped. And what's the point? P for plants, P for potassium. Potassium is a vasodilator, lowers your blood pressure. Sodium is a vasoconstrictor. It inhibits endothelial nitric oxide. Potassium, of course, also runs the sodium-potassium ATPase pumps in the plasma membranes of every single cell in your body, and it's especially important in the smooth muscle cells of your arterioles because that determines the vascular tone, the amount of contraction of the smooth muscle cells in the walls of your small arteries called arterioles. And when potassium's low, those pumps, the Na plus, K plus sodium potassium ATPase don't run so effectively, and you get more and more calcium coming into the cell because once you've established a resting membrane gradient, you couple that, the gradient of the electrochemical gradient of excess sodium outside the cell, you can couple that to pumping calcium outside the cell. So the point of all this, what I just went into, is that when potassium is low, the cell is less able to pump out calcium. The smooth muscle cells around your arterioles, therefore they're more contracted. So it increases contractile tone. It's called vasomotor tone, and the person becomes hypertensive. So that's the other thing too. You read a lot of books. Oh, 90% of hypertension is essential. That's BS. That's not true. It's known low sodium populations, incidence of hypertension dramatically is reduced. And P for potassium, P for plants. That's where you get it. Sodium is sort of this artificial thing added to the diet, especially with junk food and processed food. A lot of times with meat too is a flavorant. It's a preservative as well. Tsimane in Bolivia. They eat a little bit of meat, but primarily plant-based diet. And they were able to get this population of, persons who live far away from the city and put them they get them to ride on a boat to a nearby city and get a coronary artery, a heart CAT scan to look at the calcifications in the coronary arteries. They had the lowest recorded cardiac CT scores of any population ever in the history. You can watch videos of this stuff on the internet. Tsimane in Bolivia, look them up if you're curious. The Italian Sardinians, Nicoyan Costa Ricans, the Greek Icarians, they were featured in the book National Geographic by Dan Buettner on the healthiest people in the world. The Brazilian Zingu, it goes on and on. The Cuna of Panama, it's always the same. Plant-based diet eating populations were healthier with lower atherosclerosis, hypertension, diabetes, and the subsequent sequelae of those things. And then when they modernize is really a bad word, they're actually retrogressing into bad health. When they start eating processed food, refined food, no flour and meat and oils and junk food and cakes, they get fat and sick. So anyways, that's how epidemiology helps you, because it makes it more obvious that the way to go is 100% plant-based with no oils, and I recommend avoiding any liquid fructose. So we'll talk about diet in more detail some other lecture. So anyways, that's it for epidemiology.